Well, thank you. Thanks you for this wonderful invitation to speak, and I'm really honored to be here, and hopefully next time in person. But thanks for hosting me over Zoom. I'm going to talk today about tensor moments of Gaussian mixture models. And if you can't parse that title, don't worry, because part of the lecture is parsing the title. This is joint work with two co-authors, Joe Khalil and João Pereira. They're both at University of Texas right now. And but João is a postdoc, and he'll become an assistant professor at IMPA, the leading math institute of Brazil, starting this summer. And so huge credit to these two for this work. It would definitely not have been possible without them. And their background is in algebraic geometry. And so this talk is sort of about tensors, algebraic geometry, computations, and data science. So it's a mixture of a lot of different topics. So hopefully something for everyone. All right, so what's the motivation for this work? So it's basically making sense of data using models. So that's what we want to do. So suppose we are given a set of data points. So here I just have 1,000 data points in 2 dimensions. So every data point has an x1 and an x2. And I think, okay, how can I make sense of this cloud of points? So one thing that people often do is create some sort of model of the probability density from the data points. So for example, if there's a MATLAB routine that just does sort of an arbitrary density. So I call that and I can get a density that looks like this in 3D. So I have, get my little laser pointer, I have x1, x2, and then the height tells me how dense points are in that region. And so if I look at the contour plot, so just the 2D version of this, and it's color coded where yellow is the densest, and then purple is the least dense going out from these peaks. And if I sort of transpose that onto my data, you can see here that, it's picking up where the density is in the points. So the densest are at these 3 peaks. And so it sort of picks that up, and then the density decreases as you move away from those peaks. So we want to be able to come up with models that describe the density of our data. So that's our goal. So one common model for describing data distributions is just the plain old Gaussian. So you might know it as the bell curve or the normal distribution. So we'll denote it with an n before normal. What we have is an n-dimensional random variable that we'll call x. And then the normal distribution is described by 2 parameters. So the first is the mean or the center, which we'll denote as a mu. And then the second is an n by n covariance matrix, which is symmetric, positive, definite. There's a function that you can use that gives you what the probability density function is for a normal distribution. It's a function of mu and sigma, and it's sort of ugly looking. Don't worry about that. You don't really actually need to know that at all for this talk. Just know that it makes a bump in n dimensions. So this is the 2D bump of the probability distribution. So if we look at that sort of top down, we look at the contour plot. So in this case, it's just sort of circular contours for the Gaussian that I'm showing here, and we'll show other possibilities in the next slide, but this sort of has circular properties. And the Gaussian distribution has many nice properties. Number one, it's the limiting distribution of any sum of random variables. So it's often a good choice, because many things that we observe are under the hood sums of random variables. It's sort of symmetric around the mean, by which I mean if you draw sort of a straight line through the mean, the densities are sort of symmetric in that sense. And the marginals are normal, by which I mean if you just look at one of the n variables and you look at its distribution, holding all the others constant, it is a normal, or integrating out all the other variables, its marginal is normal. And then we also, I said we call this the bell curve. It's because it's sort of shaped like a big old bell. So that's the normal distribution. So we could try, I should say, and then you can have different choices for this sigma, which is the covariance matrix. And so I should say the mu, by the way, determines the center. So the center is right sort of here. It's the peak of this bell. And so that's here, and then the covariance gives the shape. And so there's different choices for covariance. And so you can have just a, what we call a spherical or isotropic covariance. And that's when the sigma is just a scalar, sigma squared times the identity. And people often make a limiting assumption such as spherical because it's a little more convenient. And you don't necessarily lose that much for many practical applications. So you can have a spherical covariance. So here's just an example where the mean is 0, 0, and the covariance is the identity. This is what's often called the standard normal distribution. You can make it a little more interesting by using an arbitrary diagonal covariance. So we have potentially different entries along the diagonal, and then you can end up with an ellipsoid that is axis aligned. So here we have the same mean, 0, 0, but the sigma has changed. So it's 0.2 and 1.1 on the diagonal. So it's narrower in the x1 direction and wider in the x1, x2 direction. But it's aligned with the axes. So the main axes of the ellipsoid are aligned with the unit axes. That's what diagonal gives you, and that's why it's sometimes called axis aligned. And then you can also have just a general matrix. So in this 2 by 2, a two-dimensional example, we have a 2 by 2 covariance, and you can have sort of something arbitrary, just has to be symmetric and positive definite. And then you can get sort of a sideways ellipsoid like we show here. So that's a Gaussian distribution. So we could just model our data using a Gaussian model. So we just have to pick parameters mu and sigma. So again, you can just sort of ask MATLAB to do that. And you get a model that looks like this. The peak is sort of here, and then it goes out from there. And this isn't a very satisfying model, depends on your application. So I'd say this, using just a single Gaussian, can be unsatisfying. It doesn't really get clumps in your data. It just has one big clump. So, so we often do something a little more general, which is a mixture of Gaussians, so it's some so-called Gaussian mixture model. And so we have our random variable x, and it's described using m Gaussians. So that's the number of components. We have a weight or proportion lambda j, and that says the probability of getting a sample from the jth Gaussian. And then we have our jth Gaussian, which is described by its own mean and covariance matrix. And so it might look something like this. This is a 3-component Gaussian, and its level curves are sort of shown here. So there's means sort of here, here, and here, and they each have a different covariance leading to sort of different shapes around them. And then there's places where they kind of intersect. So the point here could be sort of likely to come from this Gaussian or this Gaussian. So if we go back to that data set we showed originally, we could fit a Gaussian mixture model, and then we need to find more parameters. So if we do three Gaussians, we have to find 3 lambdas, 3 vectors mu as the means, and 3 sigmas as the covariances. And so we can fit that. And so we get something that looks like this with 3 bumps. And if we draw its level curves over the data, we get something like you see here. And it sort of picks out that there's sort of 3 dense regions, and then the points kind of spread out from there. And in fact, this data was generated from a Gaussian mixture model, so I knew it would fit. So we want to make sense of data. I showed you a 2D sort of motivating example. I want to stress that we're interested in much bigger examples in practice, many, many more data points. So I say here 10,000 plus, I would say that's the lower end. We could think about millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of data points in some applications, and then higher dimensional. So here I just say arbitrarily 500. You know, if you think of many types of feature vectors are quite long. So our big interest is in much bigger probes. And then Gaussian mixtures appear basically everywhere. So we talked about using them for density estimation, clustering, and where you try to sort of label the points and group them together. So here's sort of a clustering of those points into 3 clusters that we color coded with the centers given by these X's, and then sort of the region for each cluster given in these purples. And then you can also have anomaly detection. So if a new point were to show up, say right here, we'd probably say that's not particularly anomalous. But if it were to show up over here through a Gaussian mixture model, you could say that the probability of this point is very, very unexpected from the point of view of the model. So that's where it's often used for anomaly detection. And there are many other applications as well. So I'll take a brief pause here and just see if there are any questions. And I'll wait like 15 or 30 seconds, take a drink. Okay, great. So hopefully that was clear. If not, feel free to ask questions. And then later, I'll have other pauses. So if you come up with a question later, you can ask it. All right, so now we'll switch gears. We're going to come back to Gaussian mixture models, but we'll switch gears for a moment and talk about tensors and symmetric tensors. So a tensor is a multidimensional array. So a vector is a tensor of order 1. A matrix is a tensor of order 2. And then here I have a picture of a three-way tensor. That's a tensor of order 3. So that we call the order, we denote it in this talk as D, so the number of dimensions of the tensor. And then we'll talk only about the equivalent of square tensors or cubic tensors where all dimensions are the same. So it's going to be an n by n by n tensor. So like a square matrix would be n by n. And so the interesting thing about tensors, or one challenging thing in terms of working with them, is that the number of entries in a d-way tensor of size n is that it has n to the d entries. Let me get my little laser pointer back here. Has n to the d entries for a d-way tensor of dimension n. We call that the curse of dimensionality. So that means working with these tensors can be quite expensive in both storage and computation. Notation-wise, we'll say that A sub ijk is the ijk entry of a three-way tensor. We'll mostly deal with three-way tensors just for illustration. Everything we talk about will be for arbitrary order, but it's like easier to think about it and picture it in 3 ways. And then we say a tensor is symmetric if its entries are invariant under permutation. So a matrix is symmetric if aij is equal to aji for all pairs ij. You can do a similar thing with a tensor, only you have more things that have to be equal. So we have that aijk has to be equal to this whole list here. It has to be equal to aikj, and that has to be equal to ajik, and so on. So there's 6 permutations for a three-way tensor, and it goes up as you have higher order. And so that's when a tensor is symmetric, when all these pieces are equal. We will occasionally talk about higher dimensional tensors, and so then we have to index them with D entries for a D-way tensor. So we do I1, I2 through ID, and I call that the curse of notation because it's sort of ugly to show. So I won't actually show it that much in the talk, just a couple times. All right, so with a tensor, there are some things you can compute on it. So we just have a couple of things we need to compute in this talk. One is the inner product between 2 tensors. If we just have 2 three-way tensors, the inner product is the sum of the product of all the matched entries. So just aijk times bijk summed up over all ijk values. And so you can calculate the norm, which is just the square root of the dot product with itself. And so it's just the square root of aijk squared, and it would be equal to the norm squared. So from that, we can do sort of a standard math manipulation, which is if we're taking the difference between 2 tensors and we want to compute the norm squared, you can sort of convince yourself, because you've done this in many scenarios, that this is just the norm of a squared plus the norm of b squared minus 2 times their dot product. So we'll use this transformation a couple times in the talk. So this is maybe one of the big things to kind of remember. All right, so that's just norm and inner product. And then we'll talk about outer product. So first, I'll just talk about the outer product of a vector with itself. So if I have some n-dimensional vector b, I can just compute its outer product with itself just 2 times. So we kind of call it b, so to the power 2 to the outer product 2. And that gives us a matrix. And so this is like b times b transpose in matrix notation. And that just means the ij entry of the matrix A is bi times bj. We can do the 3-way. So the picture here, I take the outer product of b with itself 3 times. So that's sort of b to the outer product 3. So it's b cross b cross b. That gives you an n by n by n tensor. So it's to the 3rd power, gives you a 3-way tensor. And the ijk entry is bi times bj times bk. So we have an n long vector from which we make an n to the cubed object. So we kind of exploded it in a way. We can do the 4-way outer product, and then we get a 4-way tensor, and its entries are just the products of the corresponding entries of the b vector. And you can do a d-way, an arbitrary d-way, you can take its product. So we have these symmetric outer products. Some interesting things happen when you work with the inner products of these. So if we look at the inner product of 2 outer products, I'm going to say A is the outer product of a vector A to the 3rd, and then B is just B to the 3rd. If we calculate their inner product, if we write down the entry, the ijk entry of this, we get AI times AJ times AK. Likewise for B, if we rearrange terms, this sort of expensive looking dot product with n cubed entries reduces to just a dot product of 2 vectors raised to the 3rd power. So that's a big simplification that will turn out to be important later on in the talk. And then this actually is true for any order D. It's not just 3rd order. You can do that for any order D. And then so if you were calculating the norm of a tensor A that was a 3-way outer product or just a d-way outer product, if we take its norm squared, it's just equal to the norm of the vector to the power 2d. So that's equal to the norm squared of the outer product of A d times. Any questions on that? Great. All right, so now we'll go back to how we can use these tensors to do method of moments, an approximate method of moments for Gaussian mixtures. So this actually comes from some older work that I did with Samantha Sherman that was published last year, or I guess now 2 years ago, on an approximate method for computing Gaussian mixtures. So we're going to use, so the question, can I share the sides? I will definitely share them later, no problem. There's a question about, I want to talk to you about first about moments of random variables. So moments capture interactions between the variables. So what do I mean? If I have an n-dimensional random variable, you can calculate its first moment. So we'll denote that as m to the 1. So moment, the first moment is just equal to the expectation of the random variable. And so that's just the mean. And the ith entry of the first moment, which is just a vector, is just the expectation of the ith random variable, right? Ith entry of the random variable. You can do the second moment. So that's x outer product with itself, the expectation on that. That's a matrix. And its ij entry is the expectation of the product xi times xj. The third moment is x outer product with itself 3 times. So its ijk entry is the expectation of the product of xi times xj times xk. And then you can go to any arbitrary order. And these are always symmetric tensors of order D. So those are moments. They get used fairly often, especially in single variable statistics, univariate statistics. You don't see them as often in higher order because they are expensive to work with. So a dth order moment is size n to the d, so this becomes a little bit expensive. But one thing that people do is what's called the method of moments, where they try to match the empirical moments that you measure from data versus the moments that you expect from your model to estimate the parameters of a distribution. And so this goes back to Pearson. There's some famous examples there, and it's sort of an alternative method to finding parameters of models. It's pretty popular. So how can we use this? So we're going to do a special assumption. We're going to assume that we have a Gaussian mixture model and that the covariance is just sigma squared times I, and sigma squared is kind of small. Okay, and then we know that our moment of the model is actually, it's just a function of the parameters. So mu j and lambda j are the parameters that we're looking for. The dth order moment is just lambda j times the dth outer product of the mu j, and then something that depends on sigma squared. And we're just going to kind of say, well, that's just something that isn't that important if sigma squared is small. And so we'll build an approximate moment of the model where we ignore these terms that depend on the covariance. We'll just look at this first term and kind of focus on the cases where this term dominates. And so the basic idea is we are given a set of observations, x1 through xp. That's data that comes from some unknown distribution that we'd like to find its parameters of. And so we'll find a bunch of weights, the lambda 1 through lambda m, a bunch of mean vectors, and we're kind of just ignoring the covariance because we're assuming it's sort of small and doesn't have much impact, so that the sample moment, which is sort of the average of the outer products of the samples that we get from our data, is equal to the approximate model moment. We want those to be approximately equal. So we can formulate this as an optimization problem. So we have an empirical moment tensor that we construct from our data. And then we have an approximate model tensor that is based on the parameters of our Gaussian mixture model with spherical covariance. And we just want to compute their difference and try to minimize that difference. And so the optimization parameters here are the parameters of the Gaussian mixture model, the weights lambda and the mean vectors mu. And so, you can just compute that difference and go on your way. And that's sort of the method of moments. The problem is that forming and storing this empirical moment tensor becomes expensive. So it's the number of observations you have times n to the d computation. So if your n is say 1,000 and d is 3, this becomes very expensive very fast. And you also need to store this thing. So that costs n to the d storage, which actually can be prohibitive for many applications, especially if d is 4 or higher. You can sort of work it out. It becomes very expensive very fast. And we have the same problem with the moment tensor, the approximate model moment tensor. This also costs m, the number of bumps in our Gaussian, times n to the d operations and n to the d storage. But there's a hint here that we can do something smarter, because we really only have p observations of length n. So we only have p times n data, and we only have m times n plus 1 parameters. So we have just the m vectors and the m vectors of length n and the m scalars weights. So it feels like we shouldn't have to use that much storage, because really we're just starting with a small amount of data and finding a small number of parameters. Maybe we can do something more clever. So let's look at that optimization problem again. So we want to minimize this function where the x's are the data and then the parameters are the lambdas and the mu's. That's what we're trying to find. So let's rewrite that. So remember I said you could write it as the norm squared of the first tensor plus the norm squared of the second tensor minus their 2 times their dot product. So that's what we did in this first line here. Then this first term only depends on the data. It doesn't involve any of the optimization parameters. So we just set that equal to a constant that doesn't affect the optimization. Then we have these 2 terms, and we can rewrite those. So this becomes just a constant that we can ignore for the optimization. And then we just pull the summations outside. And so we just have this first term just becomes all pairs of dot products between the mu's. And then the second term is all dot products between the mu vectors and the data observation vectors. We need to calculate all of those. Now we have dot products of outer products. And so we know that we have a shortcut for those. Those can just be reduced to dot products to the dth power. And so that means that we can actually compute this very cheaply. We never need to form the tensor to compute this. objective function, and you can actually get the gradients very quickly using the chain rule from this as well. And so those are also cheap to compute. And so you can plug this into your favorite first order optimization method. Mine is usually limited memory BFTS, but you can use your favorite and then solve it. So let's just talk again about casting this as an optimization problem. We never need to form either the empirical moment tensor or the approximate model moment tensor. So we overcome the curse of dimensionality. So if we had done it the original way, we would have to do n to the d work times various other parameters and n to the d storage. We have reduced it to just m squared n plus pmn storage. And so this is much less, this is work and then mn and pn storage. This is much lower. In particular, there's no term that's of the form n to the d. So that does not appear. So we just are reducing it to just dot products. The gradients can be calculated efficiently. I'm kind of just asking you to trust me on that, but hopefully, it feels like that might be right. And then there's a scaling problem that I'll come back to at the end. And then I'll just mention also that if you wanted, suppose your P was really big, like 1 million samples, you can't really use all of them at every iteration of your optimization method. It's very easy to do a stochastic version of the function and gradient by just taking a random subset of your data entries and using those in some weighted fashion to compute your gradient. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is that one issue is that the approximation we're using is biased. So we have our Gaussian mixture model with the constant covariance matrix. We have our true moment is some function of the mean and the weights, and also this covariance that we're kind of ignoring that part. So we have only an approximate estimate of the moment model tensor. And then we have our empirical moment tensor. If this approximation was good, these two would converge as the number of samples gets higher and higher. This is converging to the true moment tensor as we take more and more samples. But what we see is that difference between those two, we take the norm of their difference. If the sigma squared is very small, they are doing well. They're sort of converging, getting smaller and smaller, this difference. But if sigma is a little bit larger, it doesn't do as well. It starts to plateau. As we increase the number of samples, our estimate is diverging from our estimate of the model moment tensor, which means the model moment tensor approximation is bad. And then as the noise is even bigger, we see that it's even worse. So, so that's sort of the problem with that approach. Even though I should say in practice it works reasonably well, but it has this sort of severe limitation. So any questions on that part?
Tammy, a quick question.
Sure.
I see you use the spherical variance for X. Does that complicate things too much if you have a full covariance matrix, not spherical?
Can you just repeat your question again? Sorry.
So you have this X follows the mixture model, mixture Gaussian. Each one of them is the equal variance, right? The spherical variance.
Yep.
What if that assumption is, you have to use a normal distribution? Each one of them actually has a full different, variance along different directions. Will that complicate the whole thing much?
It absolutely will. Yep. So that's another limitation of this. It assumes it's spherical, assumes it's small. It makes many assumptions which are not true in general. So that's definitely a limitation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So then part 2 is overcoming that. So so thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Another quick question.
Sure.
Your M, the number of Gaussian components, is it assumed to be known, or are you trying to learn it also?
Right. So in this case, I'm assuming M is known. And then I think you could use many of the techniques that are already out there to sort of pick your M in practice.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Absolutely.
So were you able to study the effect wherein if your true model has these Gaussians located closer or farther, how does the method perform?
how close the means are to one another?
Yes,
Yeah.
the centroids. Having the variances fixed, but the centroids being closer or further apart.
Right. So one of the benefits of these method of moments, at least in theory, is that they do much better when the centroids are closer together, which can confound the standard method of expectation maximization, so-called EM method.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually give some experiments later where we show some examples of that.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. That was sort of one of the motivations for this work, is to maybe have something that can handle that sort of problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Excellent. Okay, so I'll keep going. So let's say a little bit more. So what we're going to do, you guys are great question askers, because you asked the right questions. I don't want this to just be sigma squared I. That's very limiting. So we want it to be a full general covariance matrix. And so we're going to fix things, but we're going to need to do some more tensor stuff before we can fix everything. All right, so more on tensors and symmetric tensors. So we talked about these tensor outer products, and we did just the three-way, for example, of a vector with itself. You don't have to just do a vector with itself. You can do, for example, a vector with a matrix. So B here is an n-log vector, and then we have an n by n matrix. The result is an n by n by n tensor. That aijk is equal to bi times cjk. And so I have this awkward picture over here on the right. This is not symmetric, so I made it blink so I wouldn't forget to say it. This is not a symmetric tensor. So we'll come back to that, I think, on the next slide. And then you can do other things. You could have B cross C, and then you get something that is the ijkl entry of the result is bi, that's the first copy of B, bj, that's the second copy, and then ckl, that's the C that comes in. You can do C with itself, and so on. So you can do sort of any sort of combination of these things, and they don't have to all be the same to do an outer product. Now, and I said that it's not symmetric, so we can sort of say, how can we symmetrize a tensor? So if you had a matrix and you wanted to make it symmetric, you could just take the average of A and A transpose, just be the symmetrized version of the matrix, it's just 1/2 A plus A transpose. You can do something similar with tensors. I can say the symmetrization of a three-way tensor is 1/6, so the average of all the different permutations of its indices. So what this means is the ijk entry of the symmetrized tensor, it takes all the different permutations of the indices, add them up, and then take their average. So that's sort of a powerful way to just sort of go between a non-symmetric tensor and a symmetric tensor. And you'll say, well, can you just symmetrize things? We'll get to that in another slide. One interesting thing is that when you take a product of a symmetrized tensor and another and a symmetric outer product, you can just drop the symmetrization. You can just throw that away and just do the dot product without that. So remember, we're doing lots of dot products. So being able to throw away this big operation is going to turn out to be really useful. So this is kind of a very cool trick that you can do with tensors. And there's sort of some more general results that kind of tie into this. And this sort of go to the fact that symmetric tensors correspond to polynomials. And so what do I mean? For every tensor A, I can, and I'll just do like a three-way case here, I can define a polynomial psi that depends on A of n variables, z1 through zn, that is simply defined as the summation of aijk times zi, zj, zk. And so you could also write that if you treat these z's as a vector, it's just the dot product of A and the sort of third outer product of z. And so, so we can define these polynomials, and they have some cool properties. So if A is a vector, then this polynomial is just ends up resulting in a dot product with the inputs. If it's a matrix, it just becomes Z transpose A Z, where Z is the inputs. If your input tensor was not symmetric, the polynomial that you get out of it is the same polynomial you would get from the symmetric version. So these two are not equivalent, but their corresponding polynomials are equivalent. And so that turns out to be a really useful property. And then if you take the outer product of two tensors, these do not commute. So you can't just switch these arbitrarily. That's not the same thing, but the polynomial that you get from those, it does commute. So you get just the polynomial of A times the polynomial of B, and obviously you can switch the order of these because these are just two scalars. So this is kind of some cool properties. And so from this, you can derive lots of other interesting things. Just one sort of fun math kind of like, I'm already like nerding out really high, but this is even like way nerdier. There's this thing called the binomial theorem for scalars. You can look it up on Wikipedia. And then you can actually have a version for tensors. So it says I have two vectors, I'm taking their sum and taking their outer product d times. I can write this as a summation with a sort of weight of a symmetrized version of the powers of these two, these outer product powers, different sets of powers, and so change that to a multiplication as opposed to addition. And so this turns out we're going to use sort of these sort of spirit of ideas in our results. I won't go through the details of those, but that sort of gives you an idea. And this is because of the power of these polynomial representations. You can say things like this. Any questions on this tensor stuff? Great. All right, so now we'll go back to the Gaussian mixture models. And the general method of moment. So we want the general case where we have a general sigma j here. And so we can compute our empirical moment tensor as before. It's just the average of the d-way outer products of our data vectors. And then we have our model moment tensor. And so the problem is, how do we compute that in terms, how do we express that in terms of lambda, mu, and sigma in some convenient way, so that we can do this optimization problem where we're minimizing the difference between the empirical moment and the model with respect to the optimization parameters. And so this is kind of the tricky part. And if you haven't ever tried to do this, there's no reason you would know it was tricky. But if you kind of look through multivariate statistics textbooks and moments of Gaussians and stuff, you might get a hint that this gets a little ugly a little quick. So, we'll start with just the simpler problem of a Gaussian. So this is sort of a Gaussian mixture model with just one component. So just a single bump. What does its moment look like in terms of mu and sigma? So we take the first moment, which is mu. Okay, we know that's the mean. If we take its second moment, it's mu squared plus the covariance. And so you often talk about if your mu was 0, this would just be sigma. So that sort of, we kind of already knew that sort of makes sense. And then it gets more complicated. So the third moment is mu outer product with itself 3 times plus the symmetrization of mu outer product with sigma. So that's kind of interesting. You can find this formula in other papers, sort of, but it's usually written out in some kind of hard to parse way where it sort of writes out the 6 different versions of this, sometimes vectorizing the sigma. It's a bit awkward. So this is sort of a more efficient representation of that. And you can do the 4th order. So it gets even more fun. You got mu to the 4th. So this is what we were estimating with before. It's just this. But now we're actually having these low order terms explicitly. So it's the symmetrization of mu cross sigma plus 3 times sigma cross itself. And so you can keep going. And the general theorem, which is really ugly, and you can feel free to close your eyes, tells you that this is sort of a sum of d over 2 things. So this is this from d over 2 plus 1 thing. So it starts at 0. So this is the sum of 3 things of this sort of ugly looking expression. But this can be calculated efficiently. And the proof uses the equivalence of symmetric tensors and polynomials that we talked about, marginals of multivariates, Gaussians are univariate Gaussian, and the regular binomial theorem just for scalars. But I'm not going to go through it now. And then once you know the moments of Gaussians, you know the Gaussian mixture model moment. It's just the sum of those. So for each of your Gaussians, you just take its dth moment and then just weight it by the weight it gets in the mixture model. And so we have, so that's sort of the main thing to know. And this is just what we had on the previous slide. So if we look at the difference between the empirical moment and the moment, that the formula we just showed you in terms of sigma and mu and lambda, we can calculate, for example, this is just sort of a Gaussian mixture model. This is what the third moment is in terms of the lambdas and the mu's and the sigmas. And then we can look at the difference between the empirical moment tensor and this thing as we increase p, the number of samples. So we'll just draw a bunch of samples from this distribution and then look at how the norm of the difference goes as we increase the number of samples, and we see that it looks like it's converging, and so that's good. So looks like we hit upon the right formula. Of course, we have also math proof of that, but it's good to see some numerical evidence too. And then, whoops, I just skipped to the end. And then we can compare it to the prior method. We were just using an approximate moment. And just in the simple case, again, of just the simplest covariance, it would be worse if we use a more sophisticated covariance. This is our new method where we compute the exact covariance, the exact moment of the Gaussian mixture model versus our approximation, where we're really just using the first term. And if we compare those, if the sigma is pretty small, so the covariance doesn't have much effect, these are sort of tracking each other pretty well. And this approximation isn't that bad. Maybe towards the end it gets bad. So as we increase the number of samples, this empirical moment tensor is going towards truth, and the difference should be getting smaller and smaller if this is also the actual true moment tensor. As we increase the variance to 0.01, we see that the exact method does pretty good, and the old method gets bad. We've already seen that curve. And as we get even larger covariance, we saw before that one did pretty bad. The new method tracks as we would expect, going down as we increase the number of samples. So we have now a method that can overcome the bias of the previous method. So I told you that, so we asked this problem, can we calculate this moment tensor in terms of the optimization parameters? And so the answer is yes, we can. We can formulate that in terms of the lambdas, mu's, and sigma j's, so just the lambda j's times the moment tensor for each Gaussian. All right, so now we'll go back to our optimization formulation. We have our empirical moment tensor and our exact model moment tensor in terms of the parameters. And what we want to do now is optimize with respect to all the parameters, the lambdas, the mu's, and the sigmas. So it can be an arbitrary full sigma covariance matrix. So if we look at this optimization formulation, can we write it as inner products again? So we do the same trick. It's the norm squared of the first term plus the norm squared of the second term minus 2 times their inner product. Then the first term is a constant, so we can just replace that with a constant because it doesn't affect the optimization, so we can effectively ignore that. And then we're going to pull the summations out of the dot products. So we have now the sum of all the pairs of dot products of the different moments. So basically how the different Gaussians are interacting. So we're going to look at the inner product of their dth moments, and then the inner product of each Gaussian moment with each sample moment. And so I'm not going to go through the full thing except for to tell you that we can compute these efficiently. I'm going to give you one little example. And then we have an archive paper coming hopefully this week, which will have the full gnarly details for you to explore. So let me give you just an example calculation. So if we want to do the third order tensor, so we replace D with 3 here. And I just want to focus on this term, just because it's a little easier to explain. So the third order moment for each of these M sub j's is just this formula here. And then we want to take its dot product with the empirical moment tensor from the contribution from the ith entry. So what does that dot product look like? Well, we can just sort of separate it into 2 dot products. This one already has the formulation that we know. It's just the dot product of the 2 vectors to the 3rd power. And this one has that symmetrization. So we know we can ignore that. So that's the changes we make here. And then I haven't really told you how to compute this last bit. And in fact, we have like a kind of a very gnarly general recurrence in the paper, but it turns out in this case, it's simple. It's only the 3rd order. It's just the dot product of x and mu times this x transpose sigma x. So we can compute this very efficiently. And so we don't have to do anything that's, n to the d power. Everything is just dot products and then products with the sigma, just vector products with the sigma. And then, as I said, all the theory will come in this archive paper. And then, so we can cast this as an optimization problem in terms of our parameters for the Gaussian mixture model. And again, we never need to form the empirical or model moments explicitly. So we've overcome that curse of dimensionality. The function can be calculated using simple calculations. We do have now an n cube that pops up, and that's because we're working with the covariances. And so we have to factorize them and products of them sometimes. If they were diagonal, this n cube goes away. It just becomes n everywhere. But because of the working with the covariance and need to factorize those, that's where the n cube comes from. But it's very cheap, and that's the highest it gets, even if d is much higher, 4 or 5 or 6. It doesn't make any difference. The gradients can be calculated as well. Again, using something like the chain rule. I'm not saying it's trivial, but it just can all be worked out. And there's a lot of those details are in the paper. And then again, we can do a stochastic formulation. If we have millions of samples, we can just take a subset to do an estimate of the function or the gradient for the application of something like stochastic gradient descent. And I mentioned before we have this scaling problem, and I didn't really tell you what that was, but let me kind of spend the last couple moments talking about that. So there's a funny problem if we're calculating the dth moment, in this case, say it's the 3rd moment. If we look at x and y and we look at their 3rd moments, we cannot tell the difference, even though these have different weights and different means and covariances. So this funny little scaling you can do that makes the 3rd moments equal. So the general formula for that is this thing here, where I can sort of scale the lambdas by a gamma j to the d and then scale the mean and covariance appropriately. And so the moments of order d are the same. Not the other moments. Those are actually, you would not have, if you use 2 moments or all the moments, you go away from this problem. And so that's in some sense what we do, but we do it in sort of a slightly tricky way. It's not unusual. You append a constant to the end of every observation vector, and it's some known constant. You just think of it as being 1. And now our vectors are dimension n plus 1. And whatever mu j we find, you might not know its scale, but we know it has to have the last entry 1. So then we know how to scale it to get everything to be correct. And in fact, what this ends up doing is when you add a constant to the end of every observation vector, and then you do the same for the mu, and then the sigma, you just augment it with zeros in the last row and column. You implicitly get a weighted combination of all the moments from 1 to d. And usually when you do method of moments, you don't just look at one moment, you look at all of them. So you get that sorter for free, but you're only working with one moment tensor from sort of a math point of view. You just sort of sneakily added one extra entry on it. And so this means that we actually get all moments up to order d in the optimization I was telling you about before. And then again, the details are in the archive paper.
So I have a question.
Yeah, I was just about to ask. Any questions?
How do you estimate C?
C is a parameter that we get to pick. So
Okay.
we sort of say we're gonna add a value of C at the end of every vector. And then the choice of C sort of determines the weighted combination of the differences in the moments. So we have the first moment, second moment, third moment, there's all sort of hidden there implicitly. And the C sort of affects how much weight each one has. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then it's a little, I don't think we've figured out how to choose that C yet. It might be an open problem.
Yeah, because I was hoping that was a hat parameter or something.
Yeah, it's something you can play with, and we haven't quite investigated the effect of it quite yet.
Okay.
It's actually like a kind of an interesting problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a question too.
Yes.
So when we have the general covariance matrix, the number of parameters is of the order, I think, mn square, right? So that can also grow pretty quickly. So have you also considered some kind of a regularization in your optimization to make the covariance matrices sparse banded or anything like that?
I think we could easily include that, as in the optimization, since we're kind of casting it as an optimization problem. We could actually add sort of penalties like you suggest. But we haven't investigated that yet. I think that's a great idea.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I'll give you just some numerical results. So I got this great question at the beginning about the EML, about how close are the means. And so let me just say real quick, the main thing that people usually use to calculate Gaussian mixture models are expectation maximization. I won't really go into the algorithm because if you don't know it, it's probably not going to help you for me to explain it. And if you do, then I will be wasting your time. Just know it's the main algorithm. It's implemented in basically every software package. It's state of the art. It's inexpensive. It turns out that our costs and theirs are actually equal per iteration. It's relatively easy to implement. It's actually optimizing a different cost function. So it's maximizing the likelihood, whereas we're minimizing a difference in moments. It's pretty sensitive to initialization. Usually you run it multiple times and there's about, I don't know, thousands of papers on how to initialize it well. That said, people have figured out some good methods, but it is sensitive. And it's pretty sensitive to the means, these mu vectors being too close together and the Gaussians being overlapping. And that was sort of a question I got earlier. And so the method of moments has received some attention in the theory papers, and I'll just mention a few towards the end, but has not been used much in practice because it's so hard to compute with. And so the big contribution, I think, one of our big contributions is showing like you don't have to form those moments to compute with them. And this brings these higher order moment methods into the feasibility for regular practice. You can use them and they're just as cheap as the expectation maximization. So you can start to think of that as another tool in your toolbox. So if we compare, these are just some simple examples. So EM works great, okay? But there are times when it doesn't work. And so my main goal in this couple of examples, just to show you, like sometimes we do better. And it's usually when the Gaussians are overlapping. So if we take 100-dimensional problems, just diagonal covariances, keeping it simple, 20 Gaussians mixed together and 8,000 observations from them. And we've set it up so that these the means are close together. We compare the EM algorithm with the third order moments and fourth order moments using this augmentation. So you kind of get all moments from 1 to D, those two methods. And we do 10 runs each and then show you the results. So what do we have? So we have the EM objective. So this is trying to maximize the likelihood. Funnily enough, for this problem, the method of moments actually even gets a better log likelihood than the EM method. It could just be a convergence tolerance. But an interesting thing for us is that they seem to always converge, at least just sort of in practice. They seem a little less sensitive to initial guess. That remains to be studied more. But just in our sort of sample runs, that seems to be the case. It's a bit slower in runtime, at least on this example. They are the same cost per iteration. And then we're basically better in all the quality metrics. If I look at the difference in the lambdas and the one that I use to generate the problem, it's very small. The difference in the means is small. The difference in the covariance is they're about the same. And then if I look at the cosine between the true means and the ones that we find, they're basically 1, which means they're aligning. Then we do another problem, same setup, except that we have higher noise, so it makes it even more overlapping. This time EM actually does do better in its own objective function, but the others use their objective functions and do well. They're actually a little bit faster in this case in converging, and then they do basically better in the different error metrics if we just sort of look at the answer. So it's better in most metrics. So this is not that this happens in every problem. These problems that are hard for EM, there can be a big advantage to using the method of moments. And so there's a bunch of related works. I'm sort of running out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time. I will share these slides later, but there's been a lot of theoretical reasons to be interested in these. I'll sort of say that. And the few computational approaches, like the one from myself that I talked about earlier, have been somewhat limited because of their assumptions. So this sort of generalizes that. And there are situations where you might just want to look at inner products of moments besides fitting Gaussian mixture models. And these might be in sort of doing the distance between two distributions. And so there's some impact of what we're doing to that as well. And so I'll kind of wrap up to say that our focus has been on these Gaussian mixture models. And a big key result was being able to formulate the Gaussian moment in terms of its parameter, and then use that for formulating the formula for the Gaussian mixture model moment. And so from that, we can also get efficient computation and storage, which avoids any exponential dependence on the moment order. And then we talked about how to do the scaling ambiguity using this augmentation. And then I mentioned briefly that's amenable to stochastic formulations. I mentioned a little bit, but I didn't really give you any details about the dot products of moments of Gaussians. It turns out to use something called Bell polynomials, which has a Wikipedia page, but it's actually pretty hard to find in textbooks. It's really interesting sort of mathematical object that has a lot of fun properties that turned out to be really useful for us. And then I didn't get to talk about today about taking data observations and sort of removing Gaussian noise. That's something that's also in the paper. And there's lots of future work. You guys had some nice ideas today. And I'll end the talk here and give time for questions. Thank you.